Hello everybody, Silverbusters here, coming at you with another video. Today's video titled is Inflation Rises Over 5% as South Africa and Cuba experience violent protests. So we've got the latest inflation figures from the Fed and even the official numbers, which we know if we go and see how they've changed and been massaged and manipulated over the years, has come out with an over 5% month over month inflation number again for the consumer price index. And this is on top of things, this scene right here kind of sums it up. A lot of the things that are going up in price are things that are staples like meat, corn, wheat, soybeans, your bread, your milk, your eggs. Those are all going up, along with things that are just huge, like used car prices are just up amazingly. It's like it's kind of crazy, but there's a lot of cases where you could have driven a car for a year or two and then get calls from dealerships saying, hey, that car we sold you a year or two ago, we'll actually give you 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 grand on top of what you paid. Just bring it back to us so we can check it out. That's how much demand there's been for used cars in these situations where supply lines have broken down. And it is sort of tough to tell how much of it is COVID-related supply line breakdown that's still trying to be rectified, and how much of it is from the money printing, because the Fed's line is always, oh, this is transitory, which is their word for, oh, it'll all get back to normal soon, and the prices will go back down, and it won't be bad at all, is their argument. But at the same time, we've had a massive amount of money printing taking place with the Fed, and it's not only in the form of stimulus checks, but we've got stimulus bills getting passed, small business support, contracts, sweetheart deal laden contracts created by the government for infrastructure projects, which may or may not ultimately be productive based on how much pork is actually saddled in there. So we've got tremendous sources of inflation out there, of cash that could keep these prices in a lot of these categories going up, because most of these companies, once they've got you used to buying a product at a higher price point, they're not going back. They might be forced back through really intense competition, but prices tend to be sticky, especially on consumer products. There's not as much competition in those areas as we would like to think. As far as meat packing plants, there's 4 big ones that constitute most of the meat packing capability in the United States. So this is a big story, because this isn't the first month that we've hit the 5% number. This is a couple of months now, 2 or 3 months, where we've had really high inflation numbers, and the Fed is sitting back. We're getting the Fed statements, Jerome Powell, so on and so forth, saying, yeah, we're really not worried about it yet. If we see something happening, we'll act. But really, by the time they get inflation prints that are much higher than what they're getting right now, if they start getting 7, 8, 9, 10, if you start getting double-digit inflation prints, then it's too late to act at that point. If you try to intervene in the markets at that point, there's not going to be much you can do. And the other point is, it's like, well, how is the Fed going to reduce inflation, right? I mean, it's already got, if it raises interest rates, even a little bit, we saw this back in the 2018, 2019 kind of time period, when they tried to normalize interest rates even a little bit, get it off the 0 level and up, and it got up into maybe the 2% range, which is historically still quite low. The economy just started seizing up. You saw it before COVID actually happened in late 2019. There was a big problem in the repo market, which is how overnight banks lending to each other, and the degree of trust they have with each other that they're going to get paid back. Well, when you see those rates spike, that means they weren't trusting each other. So there's really not that much the Fed could do. Yeah, they could start tapering the extra money that they're dumping into the markets, but that's like saying, hey, we're going down in a submarine. We're way past our test depth, that depth that our hull has been tested to, and we're getting way past our theoretical limits. And guess what? In response to this crisis, instead of going down at 100 feet an hour, we're going to go down at 80 feet an hour. Okay, you see the problem there is that you're still adding to the problem. You're still dumping more money into the problem, and the demands are only going to get greater. All the people over the last couple of years who have gotten used to not working, who have gotten used to being able to demand higher pay, that's not going to stop. So this inflation is really going to kick off in a big way, I think, coming forward. You may see a brief pullback, but getting it to comfortably rest back in a 2% position, which is their goal, seems really unlikely. They're dancing on such a narrow thread here that I just don't think they can handle it. And long term, this is going to be great for prices of commodities like gold and silver because they're going to hold their purchasing power when the government prints a bunch of money to keep operating, which it has to do. There's really no alternatives for it. Another big story that we've had recently is the South Africa situation. Apparently, they imprisoned one of the former leaders for corruption, and I think it's not really that controversial to say that South Africa, it was a horrible apartheid, kind of racist setup prior, but it was a functional society. You could walk down the streets, you could do business there, you could feel relatively safe there. Since the transition, not so much. South Africa has been known as one of those places where if you were, a white landowner, you just might get AK'd by random black people because they don't like you. And they had some of the highest rates of murder and just violence in general when you look at their statistics. And now this is kind of surging. This is rampant violence that's just rioting in the streets, going down to every shop, burning them down, looting them, no order whatsoever. Sometimes the police are actually involved. They've called up all of their reserve troops in an effort to try to lock down the situation, but as of today, it still doesn't really look like this situation is even close to being resolved. And I mention it because I think these two things are linked. I mean, yes, the igniting spark was the imprisonment on corruption. I guess the official charge was contempt of court, that he didn't appear to testify, and he was imprisoned based on that. But at this point, they're not under control, and that was a spark. But it was caused because of the underlying situation, and a lot of the underlying situation is the same kind of things that we saw in the United States last summer, but just to a far lesser degree last summer. The spark in that case was the police brutality incidents that you saw, and the riots that you saw, especially in Minneapolis last year, and other cities, but primarily Minneapolis was resulted to that spark. But it would be kind of naive to think that COVID didn't really have anything to do with it. The fact that everybody was locked up for so many months prior to that, and then they had this excuse to kind of burst forth and release their energy out. I think it's the same kind of thing here. You're seeing a lot of people who were frustrated, especially in South Africa. You've got a lot of poorer people who are getting hit with higher food prices, who are being constrained in their movement, who aren't, getting to have their usual patterns of socialization and a lot of the things that might have been there that would take their mind off of their problems or ease their pains, just in terms of their social life or just normal economic activity. If you go and you work every day and you're bringing home the bacon and you're enjoying your simple pleasures in life, you're just far less likely to go out on the streets and start randomly looting. And all of those things have been reduced because of these breakdowns that we've seen, and the general inflation in society is always there putting pressure on people. Because if a person is looking, it's like they were comfortable, but just barely comfortable, and they were making it before. Well, what tips them over the line and puts them in a situation like this? Is a news headline about an old leader really enough, or do you have to already be thinking, you know what, things are getting rough for me. I don't know if I'm going to be making it anymore. That mental calculus is definitely in there. So it's kind of naive, in my opinion, to not think that these things are related, that the inflation that we're seeing in the United States and worldwide as a part of central banks around the world printing money doesn't have something to do with this violence that we're seeing. Because we've also got it in Cuba, and I don't know if I can find a Cuba story on here right away. There we go. Media frets about Cuban protesters spreading COVID-19. This is kind of just highlighting the hypocrisy that we're going to see from a lot of the legacy media. And Black Lives Matter just came out with an awful, awful piece condemning the protesters and in support of the Cuban authoritarian communist regime firing upon and beating the protesters here. It's just pure power plays that if there's a country and it's a socialist regime or a communist regime, they're going to support the regime no matter what. And if it's a otherwise, if it's a right-leaning regime and there's protests, oh well, that government must be the worst thing in the world ever. There's absolutely no objectivity, especially on the left when you're looking at the situation of, hey, this is an authoritarian regime. It's like, they don't think their own shit stinks. Uh, and that it's impossible for their side to ever be the bad guys, and that's what gets stories like this. And we know there was no concern about George Floyd rioters spreading COVID-19, but as soon as some protesters come out against a authoritarian communist dictatorship, oh, we can't do that because you might have a 0.004 chance of dying from COVID. Just not that interested. Sorry, it's really boring here. And again, don't think that this isn't related to all the problems that are likely in the supply chain when you have the poorest people in the world, when they experience that food inflation, when you go past 40% of your income being paid directly just for basic food to survive. That's really when you start to see violence. There was also a similar article like this about an Arab Spring 2.0, because back when we had the Arab Spring in the early 2010s, that was another time when staple food prices were spiking. And it was kind of ironic. You were seeing certain countries, especially Egypt, were becoming net importers of oil instead of net exporters of oil. And all of a sudden, that extra money that they had for their welfare state started drying up because they hadn't done any kind of long-term planning for how they were going to substitute something in their economy to maintain those kind of standards, or even though if those kind of programs could have been sustained. So what happened? Well, you got a revolution and you got the government overthrown, and you're seeing the same kind of thing in Cuba. There's a lot of Cuban refugees or Cuban people of Cuban legacy in Florida who are saying, hey, why don't we go? I mean, we have done dumber things with foreign intervention before. I mean, arguably, we have a lot more interest in Cuba 90 miles away than we did in Afghanistan, long after, 20 years after 9/11. So we were willing to spend billions of dollars figuring a way in Afghanistan, but we're not willing to, push on the scales a little bit when a brutal authoritarian dictatorship 90 miles away from us that we could probably push over with our pinky right now if we made the effort. How would that be a bad thing? It's like, yeah, you might have a short-term humanitarian crisis, but you're getting rid of this Cold War relic of an authoritarian dictatorship, and almost in a bloodless way when you're looking at the people are already rising up against the government here. But like I said, it's all connected. It's all connected. You get back to the inflation, you get back to this mismanagement of the government, and we're going to see a more decentralized world as a result. These kind of socialist controls that are over people are going to get harder and harder to maintain until they can't be maintained at all. And you see the systems collapse, and you have to go back to a new standard, hopefully a more rational standard, but that's not always the case. You can go into a revolution and come out the other side with something worse, or at least something more brutal. Usually it's more aligned with reality. Anyway, that's the news, what I've got for you today in the silver and silver related news as far as inflation. Hope you guys enjoyed this video and found it informative. If you would, please give me a like and a subscribe if you can, and share this video. This is important stuff, and as many people as you think would be open to listening to it, hey, send it to them. This has been Silver Busters, wishing you a good day and signing out.